Today, there are many myths that circulate about sexual misconduct that perpetuate a culture of rape. It's important to dispel those myths with the people you know in order to create a safe and supportive environment for survivors. Ultimately, we need to create an environment that sends the message that sexual misconduct is not okay and it is not tolerated. Misconceptions surrounding the sexual abuse and assault of boys and men can be serious obstacles to understanding and healing, so it's important to learn just how wrong they are. In this video, we outline the myths and the facts to encourage understanding and healing. I am Kavya, a volunteer of Aware, and this is our SexEd Talks. Number 1. Boys can't be sexually used or abused, and if one is, he can never be a real man. One of the most common myths is that males aren't victims. Boys pick up on masculine gender norms very early in life. This myth implies that a boy or man who has been sexually used or abused will never be a real man. Our society expects males to be able to protect themselves. Successful men are depicted as never being vulnerable either physically or emotionally. Whether you agree with that definition of masculinity or not, boys are not men. They are children. They are weaker and more vulnerable than those who are sexually abused or exploit them, who use their greater size, strength, and knowledge to manipulate or coerce boys into unwanted sexual experiences and staying silent. This is usually done from a position of authority, for example, coaches, teacher, religious leaders, or status, older cousin, admired athlete, social leader, using whatever means are available to reduce resistance, such as attention, special privileges, money, other gifts, promises, bribes, even outright threats. What happens to any of us as children does not need to define us as adults or men. It is important to remember that 1 in 6 boys are sexually abused before age 18 and that those boys can grow up to be strong, powerful, courageous, and healthy men. Number 2. If a boy experienced sexual arousal during abuse, he wanted and or enjoyed it. And if he ever did partly want the sexual experiences, then they were his fault. Many boys and men believe this myth and feel lots of guilt and shame because they got physically aroused during the abuse. It is important to understand that males can respond to sexual stimulation with an erection or even an orgasm, even in sexual situations that are traumatic or painful. That's just how the male bodies and brains work. Those who are sexually used and abused boys know this. They often attempt to maintain secrecy and to keep the abuse going by telling the child that his sexual response shows he was a willing participant and complicit in the abuse. You wanted it, you liked it. But that doesn't make it true. Boys are not seeking to be sexually abused or exploited. They can, however, be manipulated into experiences they do not like or even understand at the time. There are many situations where a boy, after being gradually manipulated with attention, affection, and gifts, feels like he wants such attention and sexual experiences. In an otherwise lonely life, for example, one lacking in parental attention or affection, even for a brief period, the attention and pleasure of sexual contact from someone the boy admires can feel good. But in reality, it's still about a boy who is vulnerable to manipulation. It's still about a boy who was betrayed by someone who selfishly exploited the boy's needs for attention and affection to use him sexually. Number 3. Sexual abuse is less harmful to boys than girls. Most studies show that the long-term effects of sexual abuse and assault can be quite damaging for both males and females. One large study conducted by the US Centers for Disease Control found that the sexual abuse of boys was more likely to involve penetration of some kind, which is associated with greater psychological harm. The harm caused by sexual abuse or assault mostly depends on things not determined by gender, including the abuser's identity, the duration of the abuse, whether the child told anyone at the time, and if so, whether the child was believed and helped. Many boys suffer harm because adults who could believe them and help are reluctant or refuse to acknowledge what happened and the harm it caused. This increases the harm, especially the shame felt by boys and men, and leads many to believe they have to tough it out on their own. And that, of course, makes it harder to seek needed help in the midst of the abuse or even years later when help is still needed. Number 4. Most men who sexually abuse boys are gay. Studies about this question suggest that men who have sexually abused a boy must often identify as heterosexual and often are involved in adult heterosexual relationships at the time of abusive interaction. There is no indication that a gay man is more likely to engage in sexually abusive behavior than a straight man, and some studies even suggest it is less likely. But sexual abuse is not a sexual relationship, it's an assault. Sexual orientation of the abusive person is not really relevant to the abusive interaction. A man who sexually abuses or exploits boys is not engaging in a homosexual interaction any more than a man who sexually abuse or exploit girls or engaging in heterosexual behavior. He is a deeply confused individual who, for various reasons, desires to sexually use or abuse a child and has acted on that desire. Number 5. Boys abused by males must have attracted the abuse because they are gay or they become gay as a result. There are different theories about how sexual orientation develops, but experts in human sexuality do not believe that sexual abuse or premature sexual experiences play a significant role. There is no good evidence that someone can make another person be homosexual or heterosexual. Sexual orientation is a complex issue, and there is no single answer or theory that explains why someone identifies himself as homosexual, heterosexual, or bisexual. It is common, however, for boys and men who have been abused to express confusion about their sexual identity and orientation, whether they identify as straight, gay, or bisexual. Some guys who identify as heterosexual feel that due to their experiences as boys, they must really be homosexual. They may believe this would mean that they can't be a real man as defined by the larger society. Even men who clearly identify as heterosexual and men who project very traditional heterosexual traits may fear that others will find them out as gay or not real men. If a female used or abused a boy, he was lucky, and if he doesn't feel that way, there's something wrong with him. This myth, like several of the others, comes from the image of masculinity that boys learn from very early age. It says not only that males can't be sexually abused, but that any sexual experience with girls and women, especially older ones, is evidence that he's a real man. Again, the confusion comes from focusing on the sexual aspect rather than the abusive one, the exploitation and betrayal by a more powerful, trusted, or admired person who can be a child or an adult. At a minimum, they cause confusion and insecurity. They almost always harm boys' and men's capacities for trust and intimacy. Number 7. Boys who are sexually abused will go on to abuse others. This myth is especially dangerous because it can create terrible fear in boys and men. They may not only fear becoming abusers themselves, but that others will find out they were abused and believe they are a danger to children. Sadly, boys and men who tell of being sexually abused often are viewed more as potential perpetuators than as guys who need support. While it is true that many, though by no means at all, who sexually abuse children have histories of sexual abuse, it is not true that most boys who are sexually abused go on to sexually abuse others. The majority of boys do not go on to become sexually abusive as adolescents or adults. Even those who do perpetrate as teenagers, if they get help when they're young, usually don't abuse children when they become adults. Thanks for watching this video. Please do share, subscribe, and comment below.